Welcome everybody to this research seminar. I'm very happy to have Iwao Hirose here, all the way from Canada and Japan. It's unusual in this time that we get a visitor so far away. So he's a professor of moral philosophy and Canada Research Chair in Value Theory and the Philosophy of Public Policy, very fitting for the institute. And he works in normative ethics and the philosophy of social sciences. He actually, apart from a PhD in philosophy, which he got at the University of St. Andrews, working with John Broome and John Skrupski, he also have a background as an economist. So very much what he's writing is a combination of these two subjects, economics and philosophy. Iwao has published a number of books. Moral Aggregation at Oxford University Press in 2014, Egalitarianism, Routledge, The Ethics of Healthcare Rationing, and the very good, which I like, the Oxford Handbook of Value Theory, which he did together with Jonas Olsson, and then Weighing and Reasoning, Themes from the Philosophy of John Broome. Today, he's going to talk about something that is rather current, you could say, restricting freedom during pandemic. Welcome, Iwao. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustav, for inviting me during this difficult time. And then thank you everyone who came to my talk online or in person. So this is a topical issue. I just published in Japanese a monograph on pandemic ethics. And it's not comprehensive, but picked up some important issues arising from this global pandemic. And today, I want to present on a paper on restricting freedom during pandemic. Whether, ethically speaking, we can justify the restrictions on basic human rights, freedom, during this difficult, extraordinary time. Now, I have two motivations. First motivation is purely circumstantial or just a pure intellectual interest. It's during pandemic, the governments take extraordinary measures and impose temporary restrictions on basic freedoms, at least during the pandemic period. Can we justify such restrictions, ethically speaking? Second motivation is rather more personal or from my experience. I served on the many ethical committees for policy making, for public policies, health policies, pandemic preparedness at WHO. I felt I had a degree of frustration. And then the nature of my frustration is related to the nature of ethics as a discipline or the role of ethics in society. Okay, ethics is a bit strange area. If there are more than two or more ethicists, then ethicists start disagreeing. Okay, they start debating, discussing, and then all quite often disagree each other. And then in ethics committee, okay, people disagree about many things. Some people are consequentialists, other people are Aristotelian, some other people are Kantian, etc., etc. And then, strangely, ethics committee is always demanded by policymakers or senior civil servants or politicians or parliament, or sometimes other scholars in other disciplines, such as in this case, public health or economists, etc., etc. So everyone says outside ethics, says ethics is important, we need ethics. Okay, so we are highly demanded by other people. However, we are at the same time we are really hated by them because philosophers always disagree about everything. Doesn't help us to get the result. Okay, we don't want to hear the debate and discussions and disagreement and fight amongst ethicists. Okay, and then sometimes we are ignored. Okay, here's a policy we want to put forward. Okay, give me rubber stamp. And then that's it. That's the only job you have to do. The only job you have to do is to give an ethical reason to justify given policy or arrangement. And you don't need to add anything new. You just add ethical reason to support policy. Okay? I find in this kind of situation, I felt that the academic or intellectual integrity of ethics is not required or demanded or expected. Of course, as a professional ethicist, I want to have certain degree of integrity and intellectual integrity, as well as intellectual responsibility. So I just ask myself, what is the role of ethicists or ethics committee in practice or in policy making? Okay, so today's talk is aimed at wider audience, not restricted to ethicists. Okay, so if I talk to only ethicists, then I'm willingly to propose, put forward, and defend my preferred principle or argument or theory. But today I want to talk to wider audience, philosophers as well as scholars in public health or politics or sociology or economics or any other field or lay people. Okay, so ethics is just one perspective amongst others. Okay, when we want to take certain actions, public actions or collective actions to this pandemic, then ethics offers one perspective. Public health or epidemiology can give different perspective. Mental health can offer different perspective. Economics can different perspective. Okay, so ethics is just one perspective amongst many. And then, I ask myself, what do non-ethicists want to know from ethicists, right? As I said earlier, non-ethicists probably don't want to hear the disagreement amongst ethicists. Rather, what ethicists collectively say about certain phenomenon or policy making in this context during pandemic. So non-philosophers, okay, want to know what is ethically uncontroversial. Okay, many ethicists can agree. Okay, and then what is ethically contentious issue. Okay, if we want to do certain policy, okay, there might be a certain perspective in ethics which may object to such a policy. Right, so they want to know the borderline between uncontroversial one and controversial policy, ethically speaking. Okay. Now, so in order to meet the second requirement, I want to assume for today's talk the common ground constraint. Okay? The common ground constraint is that in principle, ethical recommendations for pandemic response or preparedness should be based upon the claims that are supported by major respectable ethical theories. Okay, then, what is major or respectable ethical theories? There are different kinds of theories: consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, and others. Particularism and other things, divine command theory. But I would say major ethical theories, it's safe to say consequentialism, different types of consequentialism, and then deontologies, and probably some virtue ethics. Okay, and then ethicist's task is to clarify, elucidate the implications, problems, and disagreements. Okay, amongst ethicists. Okay, and then we elucidate those implications, problems, and disagreements very clearly. Okay, and then identify the borderline between what is contentious and what is not contentious. Okay? So the common ground is like a common sense amongst ethicists. Okay? And then we can deviate from this common ground constraint. Okay? And then, but we have to clarify that deviation is quite contentious, and then many or some other ethicists might disagree. Now, example of common ground constraint in the present context, in the pandemic, is, say, how we distribute scarce healthcare resources. Okay? So one common ground is this, lives. All other things being equal, it is right to maximize the number of lives saved. Okay? So just imagine big ship is sinking, and then many passengers are thrown out to the middle of ocean, hundreds of them, and you pass by on your own small boat. What you can do, or what is right for you to do, is to pick one passenger after another, okay, and you keep going, saving as many as possible. Okay, this is very intuitive, and then, in my view, no respectable ethical theorist would disagree with this. In a minute, I say exceptional, other controversial case. Okay? So imagine a case like you are faced with a choice between saving a 20-year-old and an 80-year-old for ventilator or ICU bed. So life-saving intervention. Okay? In this case, this life may appear to be contentious or counterintuitive. Some people would say we should save 20-year-old if we can save just one of them, okay, rather than 80-year-old, okay, for various reasons. But life says that we should flip a coin to decide, because saving a 20-year-old is saving one life, and saving an 80-year-old is saving a life. So it must be equally good, so we should flip a coin. But some people, or many people, have a different intuition, and then disagree with lives in some cases. Okay? Now, if you have an intuition that we should save a 20-year-old rather than 80-year-old, probably you will adopt this years. All other things being equal, it is right to maximize the number of life years saved. So if you save 20-year-old, then say 60, 70 years of life years will be saved. If you choose to save an 80-year-old, then you will save, say, 10 life years. Okay, so if you have an intuition that we should save a younger one rather than an older one, probably years can justify that intuition. Okay, but now can we apply this to other types of healthcare resources, such as vaccine? Okay, so imagine the following case: a 20-year-old and 80-year-old need a vaccination, and then we have just one dose of vaccine. Okay, who should get it, or to whom would you give, or should you give? Okay. In this case, many people and then many policies say we should give it to older person, say 80-year-old person. Okay. The reason is we go back to lives. We should save the greater number, and then old people have a risk if they get infected, life-threatening risk. So we should give it to older person rather than younger person. So when we talk about distribution of vaccine, we kind of have our intuition is close to lives. And then when it comes to the distribution of life-saving interventions or resources of life-saving intervention, then not all, but many people support reasoning based upon years. So lives is kind of a default position. And then in some cases, we can apply more specific, more substantive, more focused principle like years. Okay? So from this, we can say that the common ground is, say, lives, generally speaking, but that applies to, say, vaccination and probably antiviral drugs and other things. But probably if you are talking about life-saving specific type of goods like a ventilator, then it perfectly makes sense to support ears rather than lives. So I would say common ground is default. And then for some selected, some specific resources, we can apply ears. Okay? So that the implication of this example is that common ground is life. It's broader, thin, less contentious principle, whereas ears is more contentious, more specific, more substantive, and more thicker principle, ground. Okay? So distributive principle is relative to the good, nature of the good. Okay? So this is an example of common ground constraint. Now, so I was talking about the common ground in allocating scarce healthcare resources, but what about in other areas? So today's topic is freedom, restrictions on freedom. What kind of common ground we can have? What kind of a thick, more substantive principle we can adopt? Can we adopt more substantive principle or ground without violating the common ground restrictions? Okay, so there are different forms of restrictions on freedom during pandemic. Typical one is quarantine. Okay, quarantine can take different forms such as isolation, compulsory hospitalization against the patient's will. Okay, the closure of non-essential business. That's a topic I'm going to discuss second half of today's talk. Okay, such as hairdressers, gym, that kind of thing should be closed by the government. Curfew, many countries like Canada, people cannot leave home after 8 o'clock, even for exercise. Okay? So curfew can be justified. This decrease social mixing, so you have to keep, say, at least 2 meters distance from other people. Okay? So this kind of a restriction can constrain people's freedom of movement. Okay? And then border controls. Many countries deny the entry of non-essential travelers and infringement of privacy. So in the context of, say, contact tracing, whether the government is allowed to collect data, individual person data from cell phone data. Okay? So this violation of privacy is serious issue. And then these restrictions are not justified and are not justified under the normal circumstances. But during the pandemic period, these are, without much discussion, are violated. Okay? Now, today's talk is an ethical thing, so I don't go into this legal framework in detail. But usually, legally speaking, there are certain international standards for the restriction of individual freedom. That is called Siracusa principles. Okay, so if state restricts individual freedom or basic human rights, then those restrictions must be in accordance with law, based on a legitimate objective, strictly necessary in a democratic society, the least restrictive and intrusive means available, and not arbitrary, unreasonable, or discriminatory. But this is an international legal standard. I'm interested in ethics. Okay, so let's start with the common ground in this context. Okay, so the common ground, okay, the claim that would be accepted by all major respectable ethical theories would be this. Let's start with this then. It is right to minimize the restrictions on basic freedom. This is intuitive. I think nobody would disagree with this. That means probably this common ground is too trivial. It doesn't help us to understand ethical grounds for restricting or limits of restrictions on individual freedom. But my claim today is that if you want to have more substantive one, thicker ground, then probably we have to go against this common ground, this really trivial one. Okay. So, what is kind of a respectable ethical theories or arguments or principles in the context of restricting individual freedom? I can think of three. One is a total good. I can restrict your freedom because that will promote total or sum of good in society. This is obviously utilitarian way of thinking. Second one is paternalism. I can restrict your freedom because that is good for you. Okay, I will explain each of these in a minute. Okay, and then I don't know what kind of theory is based upon paternalism or paternalism based on which principle, but I can imagine, for example, some type of, say, Kantian deontologist would like this kind of argument, okay? If there's no benefit for the person whose freedom is restricted, then that person, restriction on that person's freedom can be seen as using that person as a mere means, okay? So there must be at least some sort of benefit to the person whose freedom is restricted, okay? So I speculate that paternalism is at least consistent with, say, standard reading of Kantian ethics. The last one is a harm principle. Okay, so I think this liberal utilitarians would support this principle. So the harm principle is famously endorsed and then defended by John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is one of the most famous utilitarian philosophers, and then he even claimed that he proved utilitarianism. But in his book on liberty, he considers the importance of individual freedom, and even though he's a utilitarian, he identifies the conditions under which individual liberty or freedom can be restricted. And then his idea is this harm principle, and I will explain in a minute. Okay, let's start with the total good. So restrictions on a person's basic freedom and rights can be justified when and because they maximize the sum of people's good. If and only if, probably. Okay, so let's talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. I didn't think carefully there. Okay, so this is obviously utilitarian consequence way of thinking. Okay, and then my impression is that most of public discussions about restrictions on individual freedom is based upon this total good. And my impression is that almost all public health doctors are more or less utilitarian. Maximize total health, minimize harm caused by this pandemic. I haven't seen many Kantian or libertarian public health doctors. Okay? So I think I take total good to be the most popular view amongst public health doctors and in public debate. I think this is very intuitive and easy to understand. Now, paternalism is that restrictions on a person's basic freedom can be justified when and because they promote his or her good. Okay, once again. If and only if. I will come back. Okay. But paternalism is usually justified in different contexts. For example, pension. I don't want to pay monthly pension contribution, but I have to because many people like me are not prudent enough to save up money, so they forcibly contribute forces me to contribute pension every month. And that is good for me after I retire. Okay? And health insurance as well, seat belt fastening, helmet wearing for cyclists, and so on. These are at least, okay, not many people want to do these, but there will be benefit for me in future. So there must be expected benefit from these restrictions on freedom. So total good, so what's the difference between total good and paternalism? So total good can justify the restrictions on a person's basic freedom, even if the restrictions do not benefit that person. Okay, so even if when my freedom is restricted, and if there's no need for benefit for me, okay, according to total good. Whereas paternalism requires some sort of benefit, be it small or large, to me. Okay? The harm principle is this. So here's a quote from John Stuart Mill. Maybe the first sentence is most important. The only purpose for which power can be rightly exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So the purpose or justification or grounds for restricting, the only grounds for restricting people's freedom is to prevent further harm that person would cause. Okay, so during pandemic, okay, if I get virus and I'm infected, then my freedom can be restricted, okay, and put in the hospital against my will, because if I was walking around the street, continued to walk in the street, then I would transfer virus to other people, transmit virus to other people, and that will cause serious harm in future, and there will be expected harm from my freedom. Okay, and then the harm principle would disagree. There's a difference between harm principle on the one hand, total good and paternalism on the other hand. Okay, so total good does not really care about harm to other people. Okay, if my freedom will cause greater harm than the good of my keeping freedom, then we can justify restriction of my freedom. But otherwise, the harm principle. Let me say this. The harm principle would disagree with total good, because total good does not require harm to other people. Okay, in order to what I'm saying. Okay, let me start again. Total goods, okay, can justify restriction on freedom, regardless of my freedom harm other people. Okay, so only if my freedom cause greater harm than benefit to me, okay, then I can justify restrictions. Okay, what is the difference from paternalism? Is that in this case, paternalism is all about benefits to the person whose freedom is restricted. Okay, whereas harm principle is that's a restricted domain for the person whose freedom is restricted. Okay, so there's a difference. So harm principle is substantially different from total good and paternalism. Okay. Now I want to consider two cases. One is that all these theories can justify type of freedom, which all these three different types of theories can jointly support the restriction. Okay, and then the other one is that the case where those three theories disagree. Okay, the first case is quarantine. Now, according to total good, I think this is easy to justify. Okay, so whether we can quarantine, deprive someone of his or her freedom, really depends on whether the expected overall benefit from quarantine someone exceeds the overall bad of quarantine for the society as a whole. So we just look at cost and benefit as a whole, and then we just weigh up, and then in certain cases we can justify. Okay, so it really depends on the cost and benefit of this quarantine. Paternalism. In my view, that probably it's a bit harder to justify quarantine, but it's perfectly possible. Okay, so probably it's whether paternalism can justify quarantine depends on the cases. The first case I want to consider is a symptomatic patient. So someone who has fever or coughing, it's obvious that person has been infected. Okay, for this kind of case, okay, it's perfectly okay to quarantine, isolate symptomatic patients because we can provide medical care and we observe their health condition. Okay, so there's some, I don't know, this is huge or small, but there's benefit for the person whose freedom is restricted. Okay, what about second case? Asymptomatic individual. So someone who are infected but that don't have a symptom. And then this COVID-19 case, it is well known that there are quite large number of people have no symptom, even though they are infected. Okay. In this case, it is not clear whether those asymptomatic patients can benefit from quarantine. If they happen to develop symptom, then probably there's a benefit for that person. But if there's no symptom after all, then probably not much benefit for this asymptomatic individuals. So depends on situation, but I think paternalism can somewhat justify quarantine. So harm principle. Okay, so if you are infected, okay, you may transmit virus to other people, and then that transmission may, in turn, okay, harm other people. So having virus, being infected, pose large or small risk to other people. Okay, so to prevent harm to other people, we can put infected individuals in hospital and isolate those people from other people. Okay? So I think harm principle can justify quarantine very easily. But difficult case is closure of non-essential business. And I think in Europe or North America, many countries except Sweden and Japan and some other countries, Taiwan, South Korea, not many people doubt about the legitimacy of closure of non-essential business. So obviously, any country, essential business are allowed to operate, but closure of non-essential business, such as shoe shops, clothes shop, other things, okay, forced to close during this pandemic. Okay. Can we justify this? So, okay, the caveat is that I assume the business owner have a right or basic freedom to operate or run their own business. Okay, this is not trivial. This is not self-evident because if you are in North Korea, probably people don't have such a freedom or rights. Okay, but under normal capitalist society, I take it to be a very basic freedom. Now let's assume operating non-essential businesses basic freedom. Now total good, I think, can easily justify the closure of non-essential business. Once again, it depends on what kind of benefit, how much of benefit we can get out of closure and how much cost we will produce incur from this closure of non-essential business. So it all depends on the effects, good effects and bad effects of this policy. But in ethically speaking, closure of non-essential business is not itself a bad thing. So paternalism may be justified if we adopt a very wide, generous interpretation of paternalism. Let me explain. I think a straightforward way to understand the closure of non-essential business from the perspective of paternalism is this. The burden, so business owner or employees of non-essential business, they will suffer from financial loss, losing job, etc., etc. But really, we ask the question whether those business owners and employees have benefit from closure of non-essential business. And then, in my view, they don't get any benefit from closure of non-essential business. They only have loss. So there's no benefit for the persons or people whose freedom is restricted. So this is, I think, straightforward way to understand the closure of non-essential business from paternalistic point of view. So I think it's straightforward interpretation cannot justify or does not justify the closure of those businesses. But if we adopt wider interpretation, then we may be able to justify the closure. So one way, I hope this is not too far-fetched, is that business owners may not have any benefit during the closure. But if you close, say, just 1 month, we can open up again, and then you will have a better business opportunities after that. So this is a small cost in long run. This is very small cost for the business owner and the employee. I think this is one way to understand paternalism might be able to justify the closure of non-essential business. But this seems to be, I can't really believe this because so many countries, Europe and Australia and other countries, they close, lockdown for 1 month, open up, once again we have a peak, and then we close down again. In the whole year, probably business owners and employees in non-essential business didn't have any benefit from the lockdown or the closure of non-essential business. So I think it's if we have this kind of really broad understanding of paternalism, then probably we might be able to give a far-fetched justification for the closure of non-essential business. But I think such a deviation from the standard interpretation is not particularly desirable in the present context and in the context where we try to justify or we try to find a justification for restricting individual freedom. Now, harm principle. It's same like a paternalism. I think it's a narrow interpretation or standard interpretation does not justify the closure, but if we adopt a wider interpretation, we may be able to give justification. So narrow interpretation is the owner and employees do not harm the customers. So take restaurants. So what happens usually is that, it is now known that the many transmission happen in closed space such as bars and restaurants. That's for sure. Now, question is whether the owner and employees harm customer, or someone who got infected in the restaurant or bars. What happens usually is that some customers, the virus transmit from some customers to other customers, not from the owner or employees to customers. Okay, so if the business owner takes an appropriate measure for the public health, such as keep the distance between tables, have a better ventilation in restaurants, ask all customers to sanitize when they enter the premises, okay, then probably if the owner and the employees take appropriate measure for public health measure, then even if virus transmit from some customers to other customers, I cannot believe that owner and employees are harming customers or people who are infected. Okay, so I find that standard narrow interpretation cannot justify the closure of non-essential business. Now, let's try to have a more generous interpretation of the principle. So their business harms the customers by letting infections happen in their premises. Okay, this is significant deviation from the standard interpretation of the harm principle. Okay, so the idea is that someone punched someone else in my car park, so I harmed the guy who was punched. That's the idea. That is, I don't know, far-fetched or ridiculous interpretation of the harm principle, but we can widen the interpretation this way. But I think it's this also, once again, okay, A, this is a bit far-fetched interpretation. B, I don't want to relax the interpretation in the context of restricting individual freedoms. Okay, so I don't want to give easy argument for restricting people's individual freedom, the basic freedom, right? So one is that's just a ridiculous interpretation. Second one is ethical reason. That's why I don't want to say that the harm principle can justify the closure of non-essential business easily. Okay, so the idea now, the case of quarantine, all three major theories or principles can justify quarantine. We don't need to do any ridiculous reinterpretation of these principles. In the case of closure of non-essential business, total good can do good job, but paternalism and harm principle, we need to reinterpret and give wider interpretation to justify the restrictions on individual freedom. So in this case, the first case, common ground, probably restricting individual freedom in the form of quarantine can be a common ground. Whereas in the context of the closure of non-essential business, we must commit to one particular idea or more contentious claim put forward by total good. Okay, so we must violate the common ground restriction in the case. So as I said, there are different forms of violations of freedom. We can go through, each of these, whether all these three major theories can support. Okay, and then it's not easy to justify all these restrictions which have been taken for granted in many countries. Okay, so what ethicists can say is that, well, from the perspective of public health, closure of non-essential business is a very effective thing to do. Let's assume that. Okay, even if public health doctors say that to the Ministry of Health or the Prime Minister, ethicists still can be united and claim that the closure of non-essential business is ethically problematic, whereas quarantine is not. Okay, so that's what philosophers can contribute on the basis of common ground restriction. But now the common ground leads us to very thin, trivial recommendations and some thick recommendations. So thick recommendation, relatively speaking, is that the quarantine case. Okay, SIN recommendation is that the minimizing the restrictions on, we should minimize the restrictions on basic freedom. Okay. Now, it is not easy to justify the restrictions on some basic freedom, such as the closure of non-essential business, without violating common ground constraint or without committing to substantive and ethically contentious claim. Okay. So, the last part I want to say, I must finish soon. Right?
It's okay.
Yeah. Okay, I will 10 minutes. So I said it's it's a common ground constraint may lead as very thin, trivial recommendation. This sounds bad, okay, for ethicists. But actually it's not too bad. And I want to give you one example of debate, public debate, which I have been involved in Japan, in Japanese news outlet. Okay, the idea is test all policy. Okay, I will explain this. Now, from the beginning of this pandemic, WHO issued bunch of recommendations. The first one was test and isolate. Test as many people as possible and find infected people and isolate them. Okay, so that's WHO recommendation. And from there, actually, many people had the idea that, okay, we should maximize the number of test cases in society. That is one of the measures to see whether the government is doing right thing or wrong thing. Okay? The number of total PCR tests, okay, or tests per 1 million population, or 10 million, is sometimes seen as a measure of government's efforts to contain the virus. Okay? And then this is very kind of widely held view or intuition in the beginning of pandemic. And then even now, quite lots of people support this kind of thing. Okay? Example is that, for example, Sweden and Japan, good case. Relatively speaking, compared to other European or North American countries, PCR test cases are very small. And many people say, well, Swedish government, Japanese government, they are not doing a good job. Okay? They are too lazy or they are not interested to protect their citizens. Okay? So that kind of allegations or criticism are based upon this kind of idea. Okay? Now, it's one extreme idea I encountered in Japan is that when the second wave of pandemic, one university professor in economics said, we should lock down central Tokyo, cut the transport, and isolate people in Tokyo, and test all Japanese Tokyo residents. Okay? And then we find the infected people in Tokyo and isolate them. Okay? Now, I found this is ridiculous. It's ineffective, irrational, and unethical. And I will explain briefly. To understand my argument, first let me explain the nature of PCR test. So PCR test is a binary classification test. So we test someone, result is positive or negative. There's no possibility for indifferent or on a par or undetermined. Okay, so only false and positive or negative. Okay, and then there are infected people. Okay, and then non-infected people, people who are not infected, and then we test them and then test positive, and then test negative. Sometimes, this is an important thing, is that this PCR test is not perfect, okay? And then the performance of binary classification test can be measured two factors. One is sensitivity, the other is specificity. Okay?
That's all one.
Yeah. So take example. So sensitivity means that how quickly we can find true positive. Okay. So true positive. So people who are infected but test positive, this is correct, true, positive population A. And then, since the test is not perfect, okay, sometimes we have false negative case. So infected but test negative. So this is a false negative case. And then not infected but still tested positive. That's a false positive. Okay, and then test negative, but it turns out that person is not, and in fact, turned out that not infected. That's true negative. So sensitivity measure ratio of A in all infected people, whereas specificity means how quickly we can pick truly negative people from all uninfected people. Okay, so specificity and sensitivity measures the accuracy of PCR tests. Okay, so let's assume sensitivity is 70%, specificity is 99%. And even this is pretty good side of PCR test. Okay, so sensitivity in 70% means 70% of true positive people. If we test and then test result positive correctly is 70%, and the false negative is 30%. So this is a binary test. Okay, so now specificity is that measures how correctly we can find the true negative. So 99% of negative not infected people are test negative, and then 1% ends up with false positive result. Okay, so this is PCR test, like a saliva PCR test is usually between 98 and 99%. So this is still good kind of example of good PCR test. Okay, so if we test all Japanese Tokyo residents, so central Tokyo resident is about 10 million population, which turns out to be the same as Swedish population, whole population. Okay, so if you include, that's only central Tokyo. If you include suburb of Tokyo, it will become 20 million. Okay, but just let's focus on central Tokyo, 23 districts in Tokyo. And we will run PCR tests to every one of 10 million population. And for assumption, the population, just 1% of population is infected at the time. Okay, this is not so ridiculous. 1% seems to be very small, but the recent antibody test shows that in Tokyo, at the point of February, antibody test sets positive rate was less than 1%. Okay, so that means even the peak period probably infection rate was, say, at the given time was, say, 0.5% at most, right? England, 12%, that still means peak period 1 or 2% of infection rate at the given time. Okay, now we apply this assumption to the 10 million population, then we will have this number. Okay, so important thing is this: false positive and false negative. Now, false positive is greater than true positive, much bigger. Okay, and then still we are missing 30,000 people on the loose. Okay, so of course whole infected population is small, 1%. 99% of people belong to this area, and only 1% of them test positive falsely. Okay, very small compared to the whole population, of course, but the absolute number is quite big. Okay. Now, I can see three types of problems with this test all policy. Right? First one is feasibility. Can we do it? Okay. How do we test 10 million people in a relatively short period. Okay, people who don't want to get tested or too lazy. Okay, how do we do that with them? Can we just drag them to the test site and against their will, we force them to take PCR test? Okay, can we do it in a democratic society? Okay, do we have people who can conduct those? Do we have enough personnel to conduct such large-scale, mass-scale tests? And I think we can't do it physically. Second problem is effectiveness. So imagine we will have more than 160, nearly 170,000 individuals who test positive, and we have to isolate them at least 10 days, right? We don't have space or resources to do that, okay? And then majority of people are not even infected, okay? So it's not effective at all, okay? And also the issue of false negative, right? These people, okay? So they are keep spreading virus in the town, okay? 30,000, it's quite a large number of people, okay? So in terms of even from the point of effectiveness, test all is not desirable. And finally, ethical reasons, okay? The first one is that so forceful, we drag people to test site itself. The enforcement of this test all policy includes violation of freedom. Okay, process itself includes violation of freedom. And then we have 99,000 cases of false positive, and then we put them in quarantine for 10 days or 14 days. Okay, even though they are not infected. Okay, and then I think it's even from the Sing principle, say minimizing the restrictions on violation of individual freedom or rights, can go against this quarantine of 99,000 false positive. Right? We should try to minimize the number of false positive and the isolations for false positive people. So I skip this. So I just want to go through just 5 minutes thing. There was an objection raised against my argument. Okay, and I have a response to that. I will just pick up one objection leveled against me. Okay, so so that professor in economics said 1% of false positive case is very small and negligible, since the real case of false positive is rarely experienced at each test site, or so we can ignore the case of false positive. Okay, and I think their argument is quite familiar to philosophers because we know the lottery paradox. Okay, so what is a lottery paradox? Is that imagine there's 1,000 ticket lottery, and then there's only one winning ticket. From each person's point of view, or each from ticket holder's view, okay, it is rational to accept that ticket 1 will not win. And it is rational to accept that ticket 2 will not win. And we go through. And then from there, it is quite rational to accept that no ticket will win. But, as a matter of fact, there is at least one winning ticket. So it is rational to accept one ticket wins. So this is there's a contradiction between these two rational acceptance. Okay, and then this is well-known issue in epistemology, the lottery paradox. Okay, we are seeing the similar thing in this context. So 1% of that's a false positive is very negligible, looks like a negligible, and then from each test site they rarely see false positive case. Okay, so if you ask everyone in test site, you may conclude that there's no really false positive case. It's not serious. But as we saw, the total number of false positive is quite large. Nearly 100,000 people will be tested positive falsely. Okay, so from the point of minimizing thin recommendations, such as minimizing the violation of individual freedom, can say that we shouldn't adopt test all policy. Okay, so conclusion is this: I assume the common ground constraint in today's context, because it is desired by non-ethicists, such as policymakers, healthcare doctors. The common ground constraint may lead ethicists to thin recommendations, such as minimizing the violations of individual freedom. This is very trivial, but actually it's not trivial. It can reveal some important things, as we saw in the case of test all policy in the context of PCR test and isolate. So I think this is the.
Thank you very much,
I
Iwao.
should stop here.
Thank you.